I had built 31 properties over 40 years, starting with a single condemned row house I bought for $9,000 with money I'd saved during 2 tours in Vietnam, and I was sitting in the waiting room of my own attorney's office on a Tuesday morning being told by a woman I had never met before that I no longer owned a single one of them. She was 28 years old, possibly younger, in a charcoal pantsuit with a lanyard badge that read paralegal and the kind of carefully neutral expression that people in legal offices learn to wear when they are delivering catastrophic information and would prefer not to be held responsible for the emotional fallout of it. "Mr. Calloway," she said, setting a thick folder on the conference table between us, "according to the transfer records filed with the county recorder's office over the past 14 months, the properties listed in this portfolio were legally conveyed to Meridian Property Holdings LLC on the dates indicated. The transfers were executed under a duly notarized power of attorney bearing your signature, witnessed and certified by a licensed attorney in the state." I looked at the folder. I looked at the stack of transfer documents visible through the edge of the cover. I looked at the small, precise signature on the top page that was apparently mine. I had never heard of Meridian Property Holdings LLC in my life. "Who is the registered agent for Meridian Property Holdings?" I asked, keeping my voice level the way I had kept it level for 30 years of managing construction crews, negotiating contracts, and surviving 2 wars. The paralegal hesitated, just briefly, the first crack in her professional composure. "The registered agent," she said carefully, "is listed as Robert Calloway. My brother." I sat in that conference room for exactly 30 seconds without saying a word, doing the kind of arithmetic in my head that I had learned to do in the jungles of Southeast Asia, when the cost of moving too fast was measured in lives rather than money. I calculated what I knew, what I didn't know, what I needed to find out, and how much time I had before the people on the other side of this realized I had found the first thread of the unraveling. Then I buttoned my jacket, thanked the paralegal for her time, and walked out into the morning sunlight to begin the most important investigation of my 70 years on this earth. Before I tell you what I found, and how I took back every single thing they stole from me while I was lying unconscious on a cardiac surgery table, let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. And if you've ever had a family member betray your trust in a way you never saw coming, hit the like button and subscribe to The Steady Father. This story is going to go places I never expected when I first started pulling on that thread. To understand how a man loses 31 properties and 40 years of work in 14 months, you have to go back to the morning everything began to go wrong, not the morning I walked into that attorney's office, but the morning 2 years earlier when my heart tried to kill me, and the people I trusted most in the world decided that a man on an operating table was an opportunity rather than a tragedy. I need to tell you about Margaret first, because without understanding who she was and what she meant to me, none of what follows makes the kind of sense that allows you to fully comprehend the depth of what was done to our family. Margaret and Calloway, née Prescott, was the woman I married in 1973 in a small Methodist church in rural North Carolina, 6 weeks after I came home from my second tour with a Purple Heart, a Bronze Star, and a ringing in my left ear that the VA assured me would probably go away eventually and never did. She was 23 years old, I was 24, and we were both far too young to understand exactly what we were committing to, but we had the kind of stubborn certainty that youth occasionally bestows on people who are, against all probability, actually right about something important. I had nothing when I married her. I had my discharge papers, my military savings of $4,000, my truck, and a set of tools I'd bought piecemeal at estate sales because I couldn't afford new ones. I had a contractor's license I'd studied for at night during my second deployment, hunched over a textbook by flashlight in a tent in the Mekong Delta, because I had decided somewhere between my first firefight and my second that if I survived, I was going to build things instead of destroying them for the rest of my life. Margaret had even less than I did in material terms, but she had something I couldn't have manufactured on my own, an absolute, unshakable belief that whatever I set out to build, we would build it together, and that there was no reasonable limit to what 2 people with a shared vision and a willingness to outwork everyone around them could eventually accomplish. The first property I bought was a row house on the east side of the city that had been condemned by the city inspector and offered at auction for $9,000 because no one else wanted it. Margaret and I drove out to look at it on a Saturday morning and stood in the overgrown front yard in the cold, and I told her everything that was wrong with it: the foundation settling on one side, the roof that needed replacing, the plumbing that would have to be gutted entirely. And when I finished, she said, "So how long will it take you to fix it? Not can you fix it. Not should we do this. How long?" That was Margaret. We lived in that row house for the first year while I renovated it from the inside out, sleeping on a mattress on the floor of the one room with an intact ceiling while I worked on every other room around us. We sold it 18 months after I bought it for $37,000 and used the profit as the down payment on 2 more condemned properties the following spring. By 1985, I had 12 properties. By 1995, I had 24. By 2010, I had 31, ranging from single-family rentals to a small mixed-use commercial building downtown that Margaret had insisted we buy when I was convinced it was too big a step. "You've been saying things are a step too far since the first row house," she told me that day, standing in the parking lot of the commercial building with her hands on her hips, squinting up at the facade. "And every time, you took the step anyway and it worked out. Take the step, James." I took the step. I named the commercial building the Prescott Building, after her family name. She cried when I told her, which was one of only 4 or 5 times in 37 years of marriage that I watched Margaret Calloway cry, and each time, it was over something that genuinely warranted it. She was diagnosed with ovarian cancer in 2015. She died in 2017, on a Thursday afternoon in October, with my hand in hers and the windows of her hospice room open to let in the smell of the autumn air she had always loved more than any other season. I was 65 years old, and I had no idea, in those first few weeks of grief, that everything I had built with her over 40 years was about to become the target of a plan that had, in some form, already been quietly assembling itself for longer than I wanted to believe. My brother Robert was 4 years younger than me, which meant he had been too young for Vietnam, a fact I had never resented him for, and a fact he had, in certain unguarded moments over the decades, seemed to carry a complicated kind of guilt about. He had gone to law school instead of the military, graduating near the top of his class at a state university in 1979, and had built a modest but respected estate law practice in our city over the following 3 decades. We were not the kind of brothers who spoke every day, but we were the kind who showed up. He had been at my wedding. I had been at his 2 weddings and 2 divorces. He had been in the waiting room when my son was born, and I had been in the courtroom when he won the first major case of his career. We had a language between us that didn't require frequent maintenance, the kind of understanding that accumulates in families over decades of shared history until it becomes something you can lean on without consciously thinking about it. When Margaret died, Robert was the one who handled the estate paperwork, because he was a lawyer and because I trusted him completely, and because it simply never once occurred to me, in 30 years of watching him practice law, that my brother would be the person most interested in what Margaret left behind. He set up the trust documents, the property management structures, the succession planning that I had put off because Margaret and I had both been the kind of people who preferred to think about building rather than ending. He did it quietly and efficiently, and I was grateful, and I paid him his usual attorney's fees, and I thought nothing more about it because I was 65 years old and grieving and trying to remember how to be a single person in a house that had been built for 2. What I did not know then, and would not know for another 2 years, was that Robert had met Sandra 8 months before she met me. I met Sandra Voss at a charity fundraiser for a veterans organization I had supported for years, 14 months after Margaret died. She was 51 years old, blonde, with the kind of easy, warm laugh that fills a room without trying to, and she had come to the event with a friend of a friend who introduced us over cocktails with the specific, obvious intentionality of someone who had decided 2 people ought to meet. I was not looking for anyone. I want to be clear about that, because it matters to understanding how I was positioned when Sandra came into my life. I was not lonely in the way that makes a person nervous. I had my properties, my work, my son David and his family across town, my routines. I was, in the way of older men who have survived great loss, functioning adequately and expecting nothing more than that. But Sandra was warm and intelligent and genuinely funny, and she laughed at the right moments and listened at the right moments and seemed, over the dinners and the walks and the slow progression of that first year, to be exactly what she presented herself as, a widow herself, twice over, a woman who had raised a son named Kyle largely alone after her second husband's death, and who had found, in her 50s, a kind of settled contentment with the life she had built. Kyle was 26 when I met Sandra. He was handsome in a slightly too polished way, the kind of good-looking that comes from deliberate effort rather than genetics, and he was unfailingly pleasant to me in a manner that, with hindsight, I can now recognize as practiced rather than genuine. He called me James, which I preferred to any attempt at something warmer, and he showed up at the appropriate family occasions and laughed at my construction stories and never once, in 3 years of knowing him, revealed anything about himself that I hadn't first asked about directly. Sandra and I were married in a small ceremony in the spring of 2019, 2 years after Margaret's death, in my backyard, with David and his wife on one side and Kyle on the other and Robert standing beside me as my best man. It was a quiet, honest afternoon, and I believed, standing there in my garden with the woman I thought I was beginning to love, that I had found something real in the second half of a life that had already given me more than I deserved. I did not yet know that 3 of the 4 people standing closest to me that afternoon had been working together for longer than our entire courtship. 8 months after the wedding, on a February morning in 2020, I was walking through one of my rental properties with a contractor when I felt a pressure in my chest that I initially dismissed as indigestion and then, within about 4 minutes, recognized with the absolute clarity of a man who has spent time in combat as something considerably more serious than indigestion. The contractor called 911. The paramedics arrived in 6 minutes. By the time they got me to the emergency room, I was in full cardiac arrest, and the cardiologist told David later that another 10 minutes without intervention would have left no decisions to make. I had a triple bypass surgery that lasted 4.5 hours, performed by a surgical team I have never been able to adequately thank, and I spent 11 days in the cardiac intensive care unit before they moved me to a regular room for another week of recovery. I was unconscious for the first 3 days following surgery. For another 4 days after that, I was conscious but heavily medicated, in the specific fog of post-surgical recovery where time becomes elastic and the sequence of events loses its normal reliability. I slept in long, formless stretches and woke disoriented and drifted back under before I could fully account for where I was or what day it was or who had been in the room. Sandra was there every day. She sat beside my bed with her hand in mine and brought me things I asked for and spoke to the nurses with a kind of quiet, competent authority that I found, in my weakened state, deeply reassuring. David came every evening after work. Robert came twice that first week, once alone and once with Sandra, and I remember thinking, in one of my clearer moments, how fortunate I was to have people who showed up when things went wrong. On the 5th day of my hospital stay, according to the notarized records I would later obtain, I signed a comprehensive power of attorney granting Sandra Calloway full legal authority to act on my behalf in all financial and property matters. I have no memory of signing this document. I have no memory of a notary being present in my hospital room. I have no memory of my brother Robert explaining the document to me, which the notarization record indicates he did, in his capacity as a licensed attorney in the state, before witnessing my signature along with a notary public named Diane Ferris who, I would later discover, had worked as a contract notary for Robert's law firm for 11 years. What I remember of that 5th day is a conversation with a night nurse about whether the Jell-O was cherry or strawberry flavored, and a phone call from David that I fell asleep in the middle of, and a dream about Margaret standing in the garden of the first house we ever sold. But according to the legal record, I was alert, coherent, fully informed of the document's contents, and in complete agreement with its terms. I came home from the hospital in early March, thinner than I had been since my 20s and moving with the careful deliberateness of a man who has recently been reminded of his own mortality in fairly dramatic terms. Sandra had prepared the house beautifully, my prescriptions organized, my meals planned, a schedule of follow-up appointments printed and posted on the refrigerator with the kind of systematic attention to detail I had always admired in her. For the first 6 months of my recovery, I was not myself. That is the most honest way I can put it. The surgery and its aftermath had taken something from me temporarily, not my mind, but my energy, my drive, the restless forward momentum that had carried me through every decade of my adult life. I rested. I attended my cardiac rehabilitation appointments. I let Sandra handle things. I let Sandra handle things. Those 5 words are the most expensive sentence I have ever spoken, even passively, even by omission. I let Sandra handle the mail. I let Sandra handle the phone calls from property managers. I let Sandra handle the quarterly reviews with the accountant, a man named Peterson who had done our books for 8 years and who I would later learn had been replaced, quietly and without my knowledge, by a new firm Sandra had selected 3 months into my recovery. When I finally began to feel like myself again, around the 9th or 10th month after surgery, I started asking questions. Not suspicious questions. I was not suspicious yet. Just the natural questions of a man resuming oversight of a business empire he'd temporarily stepped back from. I called one of my property managers to ask about a roof repair I'd approved before the heart attack. He seemed confused. He told me the property had been transferred to a new management company 6 months earlier, and that all his communications had been redirected accordingly. I called the new management company. They told me they managed the property on behalf of Meridian Property Holdings LLC and that all ownership inquiries should be directed to the registered agent. The registered agent was my brother Robert. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after that call, the phone still in my hand, looking at the wall of my kitchen, the kitchen Margaret and I had renovated together in 2001, and I did the same kind of arithmetic I would later do in that attorney's waiting room. I added up the inconsistencies of the past year. The new accountant I hadn't approved. The redirected mail I'd assumed was a forwarding error. The property management communications that had gone quiet in a way I'd attributed to things simply running smoothly while I recovered. I had attributed it to things running smoothly. I got up from the table, went to my home office, and started making phone calls. It took me 4 days of phone calls, records requests, and online searches to understand the full scope of what had been done to me while I recovered from heart surgery, and each day's discoveries built on the last like floors of a building being constructed in reverse, from the roof down to the foundation, revealing a structure I had been living inside without ever understanding its true shape. 31 properties. I had owned 31 properties on the morning I had my heart attack. By the time I started making phone calls, 10 months later, 17 of those properties had been transferred to Meridian Property Holdings LLC. 6 more were in process, transfer documents filed but not yet fully recorded. The remaining 8 were still in my name, possibly because the pace of the operation had been slowed by some administrative detail I couldn't yet identify, or possibly because they were being kept in place specifically so I would notice something on the surface that looked like normalcy. The total assessed value of the 17 transferred properties was approximately $4.2 million. I sat with that number for a long time. $4.2 million, accumulated over 40 years of pre-dawn mornings and post-midnight calculations and the kind of unromantic, incremental work that the people who benefited most from it had apparently decided was less morally significant than their desire to possess it without earning it. I did not call Sandra. I did not call Robert. I had 30 years of construction experience, 2 military tours, and 4 decades of business negotiations behind me, and all of it told me the same thing: do not reveal your position until you understand the full battlefield. Instead, I called my son David. David James Calloway was 41 years old, an engineer with his mother's eyes and my stubbornness and a moral clarity about right and wrong that had occasionally frustrated me when he was young and now, sitting across from him at a diner table 2 towns from our neighborhood where no one would recognize us, felt like the most solid ground I had stood on in months. I told him everything I had found. I watched his face move through surprise, through confusion, through a slow and terrible understanding, and then through something I recognized from his childhood as the expression he wore when he had made a decision that he knew was going to require him to do something difficult. "How long has Uncle Robert been handling your estate stuff?" he asked, when I'd finished. "Since your mother died," I said. He nodded slowly. "Dad, I need to tell you something I probably should have told you sooner, but I talked myself out of it because I wasn't sure it meant anything and I didn't want to cause trouble." He told me that 6 weeks before Margaret's funeral, he had run into Robert at a restaurant across town, at a corner table, deep in conversation with a blonde woman David hadn't recognized. He had waved from across the room. Robert had seen him and looked startled in a way that didn't fit the normal surprise of an unexpected encounter. He'd waved back, his smile a half-second too late, and David had thought nothing more of it at the time because his mother had just died and he had larger things occupying his mind. The description of the woman matched Sandra. I sat with that information for the length of time it took to finish my coffee. Then I set the cup down, looked at my son, and said, "I need you to keep this between us for now. I need to do this carefully." David looked at me the way he used to look at me when he was 12 and I was teaching him something he didn't yet fully understand but trusted me to be right about. "What are you going to do?" "The same thing I always do," I said. "I'm going to build something. I'm just going to build a case instead of a house." I want to pause here and tell you something about what 2 tours in Vietnam and 40 years of construction taught me about solving problems, because it's relevant to everything that comes next and because I think it's the part of this story that a lot of people underestimate when they hear it. Combat teaches you, among other things, a specific relationship with time that civilians rarely develop naturally. It teaches you that patience under pressure is not the same thing as passivity, that the stillest soldier on a battlefield is often the most dangerous one, not because he is paralyzed but because he is waiting for exactly the right moment to move. It teaches you to gather information before committing to action, to understand the terrain fully before you advance, and to never, under any circumstances, reveal to the enemy that you have identified their position before you are ready to take it. 40 years of construction taught me something complementary, that the integrity of a structure depends entirely on what you can't see. Any contractor can put up walls and a roof. The ones who build things that last understand foundations. They understand that if you want to know whether a building will stand or fall, you don't look at the surface, you look at what's underneath. I was going to look at what was underneath. I was going to take apart every layer of what had been built on top of my life over the past 14 months until I found the foundation of it, and then I was going to do what a combat engineer does when he finds an enemy fortification. I was going to blow it up from the inside. The first thing I needed was the power of attorney document itself, the one that supposedly bore my signature. I could not simply request it from Robert's office without alerting him, so I went through the county recorder's office instead, submitting a public records request for all documents recorded against my properties over the preceding 18 months. The package arrived by mail 10 days later. I opened it at my kitchen table on a morning when Sandra had gone to a yoga class she attended 3 times a week, a routine I had already begun to think of in tactical terms, 3 mornings a week when I had the house to myself and could work without being observed. I spread the transfer documents across the table, all 47 pages of them, and read through every one with the systematic attention I used to give to construction contracts. The power of attorney was attached to the first transfer filing, a notarized document dated the 5th day of my hospital stay, bearing the signature of James Arthur Calloway and witnessed by Robert Calloway, attorney at law, and Diane Ferris, notary public. I looked at the signature for a long time. It looked like mine. The general shape of it, the particular slant of the J and the way the C looped back on itself, it looked like a reasonable facsimile of a signature I had been making for 70 years. But I knew my own signature, and I knew the specific way it degraded when I was tired or unwell, and the signature on that page had none of the characteristics it should have had if I'd been signing anything on the 5th day after major cardiac surgery. It was too controlled. Too neat. The pressure was too consistent across the entire name, without the slight trailing weakness at the end that appears in any signature made by a hand that has recently been connected to 4 lines and hospital monitors. Someone had practiced my signature and gotten it almost right. But almost right, to a man who had signed his name on 40 years of contracts and deeds and transfer documents, was not right at all. I photographed every page of the document package with my phone, filed the originals carefully in a locked box in my home workshop, and called a man I had not spoken to in almost 20 years. Walter Harris and I had served together in the same unit during my second tour, a fact that had established between us the particular variety of unbreakable trust that only combat creates. He had gone on to become a JAG Corps attorney after his service, eventually retiring as a brigadier general and transitioning into private practice, where he had spent the last 15 years handling cases that specifically involved fraud, forgery, and financial crimes. He picked up on the second ring, the way Walter always had, as though he'd been expecting the call. "James Calloway," he said, and I could hear in his voice the same thing I imagined he could hear in mine: time, and the weight of it, and something that needed handling. "Walter," I said, "I need a lawyer who understands property fraud and isn't afraid of going after another attorney." A pause, the kind Walter used to take before major operations, when he was processing the full tactical picture. "How bad is it?" 17 properties, I said. 4.2 million. Power of attorney I signed while I was under general anesthesia. My brother is the registered agent for the shell company they moved everything into. Another pause, longer this time. "Your brother Robert?" "My brother Robert." "James." His voice had changed, carrying something that wasn't quite sympathy and wasn't quite anger, but lived in the territory between them. "When can you come in?" I drove to Walter's office the following Monday morning, choosing a route that took me past none of my properties because I was not yet ready to look at them with the full knowledge of what had been done to them and what they represented. I parked in Walter's building's underground lot, took the elevator to the 14th floor, and spent 4 hours across his conference table watching a man I respected deeply begin to methodically dismantle the fraud that had been constructed around my life. Walter was 68 years old, still lean and precise in the way of military men who never entirely leave the discipline of service behind. He read every document I had brought with the same focused attention he had once given to mission briefings, making small notations in a legal pad with a mechanical pencil, asking occasional quiet questions that told me he was already 3 steps ahead of wherever I thought the conversation was going. "The signature issue is your strongest immediate challenge," he said, when he had finished reading. A contested document signed by a man in post-cardiac surgical recovery, witnessed and notarized by parties with direct financial interest in its execution. A court is going to want to hear expert testimony on that. "We'll need a forensic document examiner." He made a note. The timing is also significant. 5th day post-surgery, still within the window of documented cognitive effects from general anesthesia and post-operative medication. I have a cardiologist colleague who can speak to standard cognitive capacity protocols following this type of procedure. "Robert was my attorney of record for the estate," I said. "He had a fiduciary duty to me, which he violated approximately as comprehensively as it's possible to violate a fiduciary duty," Walter said, without looking up from his notes. "Bar complaint, civil fraud claim, potentially criminal charges depending on what the DA's office makes of the forgery evidence. We'll want to loop in a forensic accountant to trace the full financial picture through Meridian." He looked up. "What about the wife?" I told him about Sandra. About the fundraiser, the courtship, the wedding with Robert standing as my best man. About David's memory of seeing them together 6 weeks before Margaret's funeral. Walter set his pencil down. "James, If she was in contact with your brother before she ever met you, and your brother was your estate attorney with full knowledge of your asset holdings, that's not a coincidental affair. That's a conspiracy that predates your marriage by a minimum of 2 years. He leaned back. I want to hire an investigator. Someone good, someone who can work quietly and quickly. Can you sustain normal behavior at home for the next several weeks? I spent 2 tours maintaining operational security in enemy territory, I said. I think I can manage a marriage. The faintest smile crossed Walter's face, the kind that didn't reach his eyes because none of this was actually funny. Good. Don't confront anyone, don't change your routines, don't access any financial records from home devices. Use your phone for these calls only when you're away from the house. He picked up his pencil. And James, I need you to understand that what we're about to do is going to end your marriage and destroy your relationship with your brother. Whatever you feel about that, you need to have felt it before we begin, because once we start pulling on this, there's no version where we pull gently. I thought about Margaret. I thought about the $9,000 row house and the cold Saturday morning we stood in the overgrown yard and she asked me how long it would take to fix it. Pull hard, I said. Walter's investigator was a woman named Patricia Okafor, 53 years old, former state police detective, who arrived at our first meeting with a leather notebook and a look of focused intelligence that reminded me immediately of the best officers I had served under. Tell me everything about Sandra, from the beginning, she said. Not what you know is suspicious. Everything. The way she laughs, the friends she mentioned, the places she said she'd been. The things that seemed too convenient in retrospect. I talked for 90 minutes. Patricia made notes without interrupting, and when I finished, she asked 3 questions I hadn't anticipated. Did she ever ask about specific properties by name before you married? I thought about it. There had been a dinner, early in our courtship, when I'd mentioned the Prescott building and she had asked about it with what it seemed like natural curiosity. But in retrospect, the questions had been specific, about the lease structure, about whether it was held in my personal name or a corporate entity. I had been flattered, at the time, by what I took to be genuine interest in my work. Yes, I said. Did she ever suggest bringing in outside financial advisors or restructuring how your properties were held? Another dinner. Another seemingly casual conversation in which Sandra had mentioned a friend of hers in financial planning who had helped her simplify her late husband's estate, and whether I had ever thought about consolidating my holdings under a single entity for tax efficiency. Yes, I said. And did she express any particular interest in being involved in your estate planning after you married? She said she wanted to understand how everything worked so she could manage things if something happened to me, I said. Patricia wrote for a moment. Then she looked up. Mr. Calloway, I want you to understand something about the pattern you've just described. Everything you've told me, the property-specific questions, the push toward consolidating assets, the positioning as a reliable manager of your estate, these are consistent behaviors in what law enforcement calls a financial predator grooming pattern. This wasn't improvised after the heart attack. This was the plan from before she met you. She closed her notebook. I'll have preliminary findings for you in 10 days. Patricia Okafor was, as Walter had promised, very good at her job. She was also considerably faster than 10 days. On the 8th morning after our meeting, she called and asked if I could come to Walter's office. I told Sandra I had a follow-up cardiology appointment, a lie I delivered without a tremor, which told me something about how thoroughly the past weeks had altered my understanding of the marriage I was living inside, and drove across town. Patricia set her findings folder on the conference table with the same quiet efficiency I was beginning to associate with people who dealt in devastating information for a living. Sandra Voss and Robert Calloway, she said, opening the folder to a photograph, were in a personal relationship from approximately 2010 until 2016. They met through a mutual acquaintance at a professional conference. The relationship was intermittent and conducted privately, neither of them advertised it. I found hotel records in 4 different cities over 6 years, credit card statements with matching charges on the same dates, and testimony from a former colleague of Robert's who was aware of the relationship at the time. She turned the photograph to face me. It showed Robert and Sandra at a restaurant table, heads together over drinks, the body language unmistakable. The relationship appears to have ended, or at least paused, in 2016, the year before your wife died. Based on the timeline, I believe this was deliberate. Your brother knew Margaret was ill, and he knew your estate would become a significant issue upon her death. Ending the visible romantic relationship with Sandra created the necessary separation to position her as an independent acquaintance who could be introduced to you naturally, rather than someone associated with your estate attorney. She turned another page. The introduction at the Veterans Fundraiser was not accidental. The friend of a friend who introduced you to Sandra, her name is Lynn Mercer. Lynn Mercer has been a client of Robert Calloway's law firm for 9 years. I interviewed her neighbor, who confirmed that Robert called Lynn approximately 3 weeks before the fundraiser event. The room was very quiet. Outside Walter's window, the city went about its business in complete indifference to the fact that the architecture of my life was being revealed, floor by floor, as a structure built deliberately around deceiving me. "There's more," Patricia said. There was always more. Sandra Voss's son, Kyle. The one she told you was the child of her second husband, Michael Voss, who she told you died in a car accident in 2009. "Yes," I said. "Michael Voss died in 2009. "Correct." However, Kyle Voss was born in 2003, when Sandra and Michael Voss were in what her acquaintances describe as a severely troubled marriage. I obtained Kyle's birth records through a public records request and cross-referenced against the hospital records from Michael Voss's documented whereabouts in early 2002, the approximate conception period. She paused. Michael Voss was hospitalized for a 6-week period in early 2002 following a serious workplace accident. He was in a rehabilitation facility in another state for the entirety of that period. She placed a document on the table. I arranged for an expedited genetic analysis using samples obtained discreetly from Kyle's personal items Sandra had left at your home that carried biological material. I cross-referenced this against samples obtained from Robert Calloway. She turned the final page of the folder to face me. The probability of paternity figure was printed in bold type at the bottom. 99.97%. Robert Calloway was Kyle's biological father. I sat in Walter's conference room for a long time after Patricia finished her presentation, looking at the probability figure on the laboratory report and doing the arithmetic that now encompassed not just 14 months of property transfers but 20 years of a history I had never been given the opportunity to understand correctly. Kyle was 26 years old. He had been born in 2003. Robert and Sandra's relationship, by Patricia's timeline, had been ongoing in some form since 2010. But Kyle's conception had preceded the documented relationship by 7 years. The arithmetic was uncomfortable and I did it anyway, because I had spent my life doing arithmetic that was uncomfortable rather than allowing comfortable ignorance to make my decisions for me. Sandra and Robert had known each other, in some capacity, since at least 2002. The relationship Patricia had documented from 2010 was not the beginning of something, it was the resumption of something that had roots going back further than Patricia had yet been able to trace. Kyle was the evidence of that earlier history, a biological fact that connected them across 2 decades and predated everything Sandra had ever told me about her life before we met. They had built a child together. Then they had built a plan. Then they had built a marriage. My marriage, the second one, the one I had entered in genuine good faith with a woman I believed had found me the way people find each other when they are not looking, on top of the plan. I thought about Margaret again, as I kept doing when things became difficult, the way you return to a fixed point when everything else is moving. Margaret had never trusted Robert entirely, a fact I had attributed over the years to a sister-in-law's natural mild friction with a brother-in-law and never pursued further. She had said, exactly once, that she thought Robert was a man who kept his score carefully, and I had laughed and said that was what made him a good lawyer. She hadn't argued with me. She had simply let it go in the way Margaret let things go when she had said what she had to say and knew I would arrive at my own conclusions eventually. I wished, with a sudden fierceness that surprised me, that she had pushed harder on that particular point. "James," Walter said quietly, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before you answer." I looked at him. "Kyle is living in your city, supported in part by an allowance Sandra has been drawing from the Meridian accounts. He may or may not be aware of the full scope of what his mother and Robert have done. Before we move, I need to know whether you want to include him in the legal action or treat him as a peripheral figure." I thought about this. Kyle had never been unkind to me. He had never been warm either, but unkind was the question on the table. He was 26 years old and he was Robert Calloway's biological son, which meant he was, in the most technical biological sense, a kind of collateral family member I had never consented to acquiring. He might have known everything. He might have known nothing. He might have known enough to be complicit without understanding the full picture. "Find out what he knew," I said. "Then we'll decide." The 3 weeks between Patricia's presentation and the morning we moved were the longest 3 weeks of my life since my second tour, and I say that as a man who spent time in active combat. The particular difficulty of those weeks was not danger but performance, the requirement to continue being, for all external purposes, a retired widower contentedly living with his second wife in the house he'd shared with his first wife for 30 years, while carrying the full weight of what I now knew. Sandra moved through those weeks in her normal patterns, and I watched her with the new eyes of a man who understands that everything he is seeing is a performance, her morning routines, her cheerful management of the household, her evening phone calls to Kyle that she took in another room with the door pulled most of the way shut. I watched all of it with the stillness I had learned in the jungle, the patience of a man who knows that the optimal moment to move is not now, not yet, not until every element of the plan is in place. Robert called me twice during those 3 weeks, normal fraternal phone calls of the kind we had always exchanged, asking how my health was and how the properties were doing, questions that now carried a weight of black irony I absorbed without flinching. I told him everything was fine. I asked about his practice. I mentioned that I was thinking about getting back to work more actively now that my recovery was well advanced, and I heard in the brief pause before his response the specific quality of a man recalibrating something he had not expected to need to recalibrate. "Take your time," Robert said. "You've earned the rest." What I had earned, he meant, was irrelevant. What he was earning was the point. I ended that phone call, set my phone on the kitchen counter, and went to my workshop, where I did something I had not done in many months. I picked up a piece of wood, a scrap of white oak left from a repair job the previous year, and I began to plane it. Running a hand plane across a piece of wood is one of the oldest building acts that exists, and it requires a specific quality of attention that leaves no room for anything else, and I stood in my workshop for 2 hours planing that piece of white oak until it was as smooth as glass, thinking of nothing except the grain and the blade and the slow revealing of the clean surface beneath. When I was finished, I set the piece of oak on my workbench and looked at it. Then I went inside and called Walter to tell him I was ready. On the morning we moved, I woke before sunrise, dressed quietly in the gray light of the bedroom, and stood for a moment at the window looking out at the yard where Margaret and I had been married to each other in 1973 and where, 50-odd years later, I had made the mistake of thinking I could simply begin again. I picked up my jacket from the chair, folded the certified envelope Walter had prepared, and placed it in the inner breast pocket. I walked downstairs. Sandra was still asleep. I made coffee and stood at the kitchen counter drinking it in the kitchen Margaret had chosen every detail of, looking at the wall calendar and the grocery list on the counter and the small, ordinary evidence of a domestic life that had been, for the better part of a year, an extremely expensive and elaborate fiction. I set my coffee cup in the sink, rinsed it, and left it upside down on the drying rack the way I had done every morning for 40 years. Then I picked up my keys and walked out to my truck. The meeting was scheduled for 9 o'clock. Walter had arranged it as a routine estate review, the kind of annual check-in that happens between a property owner and his attorney and is too mundane to raise any alarms. He had sent the invitation through Robert's office, framed as a joint consultation regarding the Meridian Holdings structure, which was the kind of language Robert would read as an opportunity to continue whatever the next phase of the plan was, rather than a summons to the reckoning it actually represented. Robert arrived at Walter's office at 8:58, looking exactly as he always looked, tan from his regular golf games, silver-haired, dressed in the kind of conservative suit that said serious attorney to anyone who didn't look closely enough to notice it was slightly too expensive for his practice's revenue. He shook my hand in the waiting room with the easy warmth of a man with a clear conscience, and I shook his back with the same quality of warmth, and we both performed brotherly normalcy for the 90 seconds it took to walk down the hallway to Walter's conference room. He stopped walking when he saw Walter. "James," he said, his voice shifting register by approximately half a note, just enough that I caught it. "I didn't realize you were bringing your own counsel." "Sit down, Robert," I said. Sandra arrived 12 minutes later, escorted by a paralegal who had called her that morning with what she'd been told was an urgent insurance matter requiring her signature. She was dressed for a yoga class. She hadn't expected to be coming to a law office, and the look on her face when she walked through the conference room door and saw me and Walter and Robert already seated, alongside Patricia Okafor and a woman from the county attorney's office named Margaret Chen, was the most unguarded expression I had ever seen on a face that had spent 3 years being carefully managed in my presence. She recovered quickly. Sandra was, I had to acknowledge, very good at recovering quickly. She sat down in the open chair between Robert and the door, set her yoga bag on the floor beside her, and arranged her face into something that was meant to communicate mild surprise and cooperative concern. Kyle was not present. Patricia had determined that he had been aware of the basic outline of the plan, his mother's financial positioning, his biological father's role in the property transfers, but had not been directly involved in the legal execution of the fraud. Walter and I had agreed that his absence from this meeting was appropriate. His reckoning would come separately, and less formally. Walter opened the meeting with the careful, methodical authority of a man who has spent decades in courtrooms and knows exactly what pace serves justice best. He outlined what we had found, document by document, photograph by photograph, financial record by financial record. He laid the forensic handwriting analysis on the table. He laid Patricia's investigative report on the table. He laid the timeline of Sandra and Robert's relationship on the table. He laid the DNA report on the table, face up, and let it sit there in the middle of everything without saying a word about it for a full 30 seconds while both Robert and Sandra looked at it and then looked away and then looked back. "The power of attorney executed on February 14th, Walter said, bears a signature that our forensic document examiner has determined, with a high degree of certainty, was not written by James Calloway in the state he was in at the time of its purported execution. The notarization by Diane Ferris, a contractor with the law offices of Robert Calloway for 11 years, is being reviewed by the State Bar Association concurrent with this meeting." He looked at my brother. "Robert, I need you to understand what you are looking at on this table. This is not a negotiation. This is a notification." Robert's composure held for approximately the length of time it took Walter to finish the sentence, and then it didn't. The tan drained from his face with a speed that was almost impressive, leaving him the color of old concrete, and he pressed his hands flat against the table in a gesture I recognized, from 40 years of contract negotiations, as a man trying to physically stabilize himself against the collapse of the position he believed was unassailable. "James," he said. His voice was different now, quieter, and carrying something I had not expected from a man who had spent 3 years engineering the theft of my life's work. It carried something that sounded, almost impossibly, like shame. "James, I need you to let me explain." "Robert," I said. "Don't." He stopped. Sandra, who had maintained her silence throughout Walter's presentation with the rigid discipline of a woman calculating her options in real time, now spoke for the first time. Her voice was controlled, the professional warmth entirely absent, replaced by something colder and more fundamental. "This is an overreach," she said, looking at Margaret Chin from the county attorney's office. The power of attorney was validly executed. My husband was coherent and informed. "Whatever your forensic examiner claims, the document is legally notarized and I will contest every one of these allegations in court." "You are welcome to do that," Walter said pleasantly. "The county attorney's office will look forward to seeing you there." He nodded to Margaret Chin. "Mrs. Calloway," Margaret Chin said, opening her own folder, "I am here to inform you that the county attorney's office has opened an investigation into allegations of elder financial abuse, forgery of a legal instrument, and conspiracy to commit wire fraud in connection with the property transfers registered under Meridian Property Holdings LLC. You are not under arrest at this time, but I would strongly advise you to retain independent legal counsel before making any further statements." What happened next was the thing I had not prepared for, not because I hadn't considered it theoretically, but because I had not believed, even after everything, that my brother was capable of it. Sandra stood up, picked up her yoga bag, and said she would not be making any further statements without an attorney present. She walked to the door with the same quality of deliberate, unhurried movement she had walked through every door I'd ever watched her walk through, revealing nothing. She left the conference room without looking at Robert, without looking at me, without looking back. Robert didn't move. He sat at the conference table with his hands still flat on the surface, looking at the DNA report in the center of the table, and said nothing for a long time after the door closed behind Sandra. Then he said, "How long have you known?" "Long enough," I said. He nodded once, a small, tired movement. He looked older than he had when he walked in, as though the unmasking had aged him in real time. "James, I want to tell you something, and I want you to believe that it's the truth, whatever else you believe about me." I waited. "I didn't plan for it to go this far," he said. "What I mean is, I told myself a story about it that made it seem reasonable. That you had more than you needed. That your health was uncertain and the properties would complicate things after you were gone. That Sandra was better positioned to manage them than you thought, and that I was just helping facilitate a transition that would have happened eventually anyway." He stopped. "I know how that sounds. It sounds like what someone says when they want to believe they're not what they actually are," I said. He looked at me then, really looked at me, the way brothers look at each other when the pretense has fallen away entirely and there is nothing left but the full weight of a shared history and everything it means to have betrayed it. "Margaret always said you'd see through me eventually," he said quietly. I sat with that for a moment. "She said that?" "Not to you. To me. A long time ago." He looked down at the table. "She called me one afternoon, must have been 10 years ago now, and told me she thought I was a careful man in the wrong direction. That I kept score in ways she didn't think were healthy. She said it gently, the way Margaret said everything. But she said it." He was quiet. "I always thought it was just sisterly friction. The way in-laws are." "It wasn't," I said. "No," he agreed. "It wasn't." Walter had been silent through this exchange, his legal pad in front of him, his mechanical pencil quiet. He glanced at me now, a small look that said, "This is useful, and also, are you all right?" I gave him a small nod that answered both questions. "Robert," Walter said, his voice even and measured, "you understand that what you have just acknowledged, in the presence of an attorney, a county official, and a private investigator, has significant legal implications." "I know what it means," Robert said. He didn't look at Walter. He was looking at me. "James, I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't think I would, if our positions were reversed. But I want you to know that Kyle didn't know the details. He knew Sandra was positioning for financial security. He didn't know about the forgery. That was between Sandra, Diane Ferris, and me. I know, I said. Patricia established that already. Something shifted in his expression that I couldn't quite name. Relief, possibly, that the investigation had been thorough enough to reach that conclusion on its own, so that his saying so was not self-serving but merely confirming what was already known. Or something closer to gratitude, the complicated gratitude of a guilty man who still loves the person he harmed. I stood up. I buttoned my jacket. I looked at my brother one more time across the conference room table, across all the distance that 4 years of fraud and a lifetime of brotherhood had created between us. Cooperate with Walter fully, I said. Tell him everything. That's the only thing I'll ask of you. Then I walked out of the conference room and did not look back, and the door closed behind me with a sound that felt, in the carpeted silence of Walter's law firm hallway, exactly like what it was. An ending. The months that followed were the bureaucratic, procedural, often tedious business of justice, which operates on timescales that bear no relation to the emotional urgency of the crimes that trigger it but moves, when it finally moves, with an inevitability that is in its own way satisfying to watch. Robert cooperated completely, as I had asked. He provided Walter with every document, every communication, every financial record connected to the Meridian Holdings operation. His cooperation came with the mixed motives of a man who was trying to minimize criminal exposure and also, I chose to believe, trying to honor the single request his brother had made of him in what would likely be the last real conversation they ever had. The forensic document examiner testified before the County Bar Review Board that the signature on the power of attorney was, with a high degree of professional certainty, a practiced imitation rather than an authentic signature, and that the physical characteristics of the ink pressure and letter formation were inconsistent with the documented effects of post-cardiac surgical medication on fine motor control. Diane Ferris, the notary, lost her notary commission and faced criminal referral for her role in certifying a document she had not legitimately witnessed. She had, Patricia later told me, been in a difficult financial situation at the time and had been compensated by Robert through a series of small cash payments she had told herself were legitimate bonuses for additional work performed. The transfer of 17 properties through a forged instrument constituted, under state law, a combination of forgery, fraud on a financial institution, and elder financial abuse, the last of which carried enhanced penalties specifically designed to address crimes committed against individuals over 65 years of age. Sandra retained a criminal defense attorney, a man known in local legal circles for his combative approach and his willingness to contest every element of every charge in the most procedurally exhausting manner available. It cost her a significant portion of the liquid assets she had accumulated through the Meridian accounts, money that was, in any case, subject to recovery actions from my estate, and it extended the legal process by 11 months while ultimately changing none of its outcomes. Robert, at Walter's negotiation, entered a plea agreement that included full financial restitution, surrender of his law license, and a suspended sentence contingent on continued cooperation and 3 years of supervised probation. He was 66 years old, and sending him to prison was not the outcome I had sought, though I want to be honest that it was not entirely an outcome I had ruled out. What I sought was the restoration of what had been taken and the removal of his capacity to do it to anyone else. Sandra did not reach a similar agreement. She maintained her contest of the criminal charges through 3 additional months of pre-trial hearings before the evidence of the forged document, the timeline of her relationship with Robert, and the financial records Patricia had assembled left her attorney no viable path forward. She was convicted of elder financial abuse and forgery of a legal instrument and sentenced to 4 years, of which she served 2 before becoming eligible for supervised release. Kyle was not charged with any crime. He had received payments from the Meridian accounts that the court agreed he had accepted without full knowledge of their fraudulent origin, and those payments, approximately $40,000 over 14 months, were included in the restitution calculation. He called me once, about 6 months after the trial, from a number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail. He said he was sorry, that he hadn't understood the full picture until it was already done, that he didn't expect me to believe him but wanted me to know anyway. I listened to the message twice. I didn't call back, and I didn't delete it. The restoration of the 17 transferred properties was not a simple process. Each one required a separate legal filing to reverse the fraudulent transfer, a process that took 14 months of paperwork and court filings and fees that I paid without complaint because every filing was a step back towards something I had built. I chose to attend each recording personally, driving to the county recorder's office and standing at the counter while the clerk processed each reversal and handed me the stamped document confirming that the property was, once again, in my name. It was, I recognized, a slightly theatrical thing to do, and David gently suggested once that I could simply wait for the mailed copies like everyone else. I know I could, I said. He came with me for the last one. We stood at the counter together while the clerk processed the final reversal, the Prescott building, the commercial property Margaret had insisted I buy 30 years earlier, which had been the 17th and last transfer executed under the fraudulent power of attorney. The clerk stamped the document, slid it across the counter, and said, "Have a good day, Mr. Calloway." I looked down at the document. The Prescott building, returned to James Arthur Calloway, by order of the county court. "Thank you," I said. I folded the document carefully and put it in my jacket's inner pocket, next to where I had carried the certified envelope on the morning of the meeting in Walter's office. David and I walked out into the afternoon sunlight and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, not saying anything. "She'd be glad," David said finally. "I know she would," I said. We walked to our separate cars and drove home, and that was the end of the legal process and the beginning of whatever came next. A year after the last property was restored to my name, I stood on the roof of the Prescott building on a clear October morning, the same month Margaret had died 7 years earlier, and looked out at the city below me. From up here, on a good day, you can see the East Side neighborhood where I bought that first condemned row house for $9,000 in 1974. The house itself was torn down in the 90s to make way for a parking structure, which is the indifferent way of cities and real estate and the impermanence of specific places even when what happened inside them is permanent. But I could see the general shape of the neighborhood, the streets and the blocks, and I knew where it had been, and that was enough. I had returned to work full-time 6 months after the trial concluded, which my cardiologist described as inadvisable and my son described as inevitable and which I described as necessary in the way that any man who has spent 50 years building things finds returning to the building necessary, not because the money requires it, but because the building is what makes the mornings make sense. I sold 4 of the 31 properties, deliberately chosen for their age and the significant deferred maintenance they had accumulated during the 14 months of Meridian's management, which had been predictably dismal. The proceeds went into a renovation fund for 3 of the remaining properties and into a veterans housing initiative I had been planning to establish for years and finally had the clarity of purpose to execute. The initiative provided transitional housing for veterans returning from service who needed a stable platform from which to build their civilian lives, a modest offering, given what I'd been given by the country in the uniform and the men I'd served alongside, but a concrete one, the kind I understood how to build. I had not spoken to Robert since the conference room. I received, through Walter, occasional updates on his compliance with the terms of his probation, which I read and filed without response. His law license was gone and would not be returned. Whether he found a way to live meaningfully inside the consequences of what he had done was a question I had relinquished the responsibility for answering. Some questions belonged to the person who created them. I thought about him sometimes, not with the anger I had expected and not with the softness of forgiveness, but with something more complex and harder to name, the specific grief of losing someone to their own choices, someone who had stood beside you at your wedding and stood beside you at your wife's funeral and had been, for the better part of 70 years, the version of family that outlasts everything else. He was still my brother. That was not a fact that could be altered by what he had done. But he was my brother the way a house with a compromised foundation is still a house, technically accurate, and no longer safe to live inside. David and I had dinner every Sunday now, a routine we'd established during the investigation and maintained afterward because it turned out that the forced intimacy of shared crisis had reminded both of us how much we preferred regular contact to the comfortable distance that busy lives accumulate. His kids called me Grandpa James, which was not a name I had ever expected to answer to and which turned out to suit me considerably better than I had anticipated. I was working on a new project. Not a property, something different. I had started writing, slowly and without any particular expectation of audience, the history of how Margaret and I had built Calloway properties over 40 years, beginning with the $9,000 row house and ending with the morning I stood in the county recorder's office and got the Prescott building back. I wrote it in my workshop in the early mornings before the working day began, longhand in a notebook on the same workbench where I'd planed the white oak scrap during those 3 weeks of waiting for the plan to be ready. I didn't know yet what the writing would become. Whether it would stay in a drawer or eventually become something someone else could read. But the act of it felt right in the same way building had always felt right, like making something permanent out of materials that would otherwise simply pass through time without leaving a mark. On the morning I am describing, standing on the roof of the Prescott building in October with the city spread out below me in the same cool autumn light that Margaret had always loved best filling the air around me, I understood something about the past 2 years that I had been approaching obliquely and now arrived at directly. They had tried to take 40 years of work and replace it with nothing, with a shell company registered under my brother's name, with a forged document and a practiced signature and the calculated assumption that a man recovering from heart surgery was too diminished to fight back. They had underestimated, in the specific way that all thieves underestimate their targets, the relationship between a man and what he has built. They thought the properties were the point. They thought the money was what mattered. The money mattered. I will not pretend otherwise. $4.2 million is not an abstraction. But the money was never the actual thing. The actual thing was the $9,000 row house and the cold Saturday morning and the woman who asked me how long it would take to fix it. The actual thing was 50 years of work that had never once asked me whether I was too tired to keep going. The actual thing was the knowledge, planted in my bones somewhere between Vietnam and the first warehouse and the last time I held Margaret's hand, that a man who has built something real has built something that survives the people who try to take it. I put my hands in my jacket pockets, standing on that roof in the October light, and I breathed in the season Margaret had loved, and I stayed up there for a while longer than was strictly necessary, because I could and because she would have wanted me to. There is a thing that happens when you work with your hands for a long time, when you build things, repair things, plane wood and lay foundations and frame walls, that I have tried over the years to describe to people who haven't experienced it and have never quite found the right words for. It is a kind of knowledge that lives in the body rather than the mind. Not skill, exactly, though skill is part of it. Something more fundamental, an understanding of the relationship between what you put in and what you get back, between the quality of your materials and the honesty of your methods and the reliability of what you ultimately produce. You cannot cheat a foundation. You cannot shortcut a structural wall. You cannot fake a properly hung door or a level floor. The work either holds or it doesn't, and the only variable that determines which one is true is whether the person who built it was honest in the doing of it. I had been honest in the doing of my work for 50 years. I had been honest in the doing of my marriages and my fatherhood and my friendships and the long, unglamorous accumulation of a life. I had not been perfect, no builder is perfect, and anyone who claims otherwise has not looked closely enough at their own work. But I had been honest, and honest work builds things that survive dishonest attacks, because the foundation is real, and you cannot undermine a real foundation with a forged document and a practiced signature. They tried. They came very close. And then they failed, because close is not enough when the foundation is solid. My father used to say, in the way that fathers of his generation said things they had learned by living rather than by reading, that a man's character is what he builds when nobody is giving him credit for the building. He meant it literally, in the sense that he was talking about construction, and he also meant it in every other sense simultaneously, because that was the kind of man he was, a carpenter who understood that everything he built was also a statement about who he was, and who he intended to remain. I have thought about that a lot over the past 2 years. About what it means to build something that someone else tries to take. About what it means to take it back. About the specific satisfaction of standing on the roof of a building that bears your late wife's name, looking out at a city you have contributed something real and lasting to, knowing that the people who tried to unmake what you made are now living inside the consequences of that attempt while you are still here, building. I am 70 years old. I have had a heart that tried to kill me and a brother who tried to finish the job and a wife who turned out to be an instrument of both of those things. I have had 2 wars and 2 marriages and 1 son and 31 properties and a white oak scrap on a workshop bench that I planed smooth in the dark because I needed to do something honest with my hands while I waited for the right moment to move. I am still building. A man who has learned to build never stops, not because he is incapable of resting but because the building is not separate from the living, it is the living, the specific and irreplaceable expression of what it means to be a person who makes things rather than takes them. They never understood that. They saw the properties and thought they were looking at what I had. They were looking at what I am. You cannot take what a man is. You can try. You will fail. And I will still be here, with my tools in my hands and my father's advice and my first wife's courage and my son's loyalty, building whatever comes next. Some men build with stone and timber, laying every course by hand. Some men build with patience, in a way the young don't understand. Every nail is a decision, every beam a choice made true. What a steady father builds, no thief can take from you. Though the winter came and stripped him of the life he thought he knew and the ones he called his family turned and put their knife right through, he stood up in the morning, like the stubborn oak he was, and he built it back from nothing, not for glory, just because. That's what steady fathers do, they build, and then rebuild. They put their hands to honest work and know it's never filled, not the ledger and the title, not the figure on the deed, but the kind of life that holds the weight of everything you need. So to every man who's listening in the quiet of the night who has built something worth stealing and must summon up the fight, let the record show he stood his ground and never lost his way. A steady father keeps on building till his very final day. 3 days before my heart attack, I had been walking through one of my earliest rental properties on the east side with a contractor named Dennis, who had worked with me on and off for 15 years and who shared my belief that a property kept in excellent condition retained its tenants and its dignity in equal measure. Dennis and I had a ritual when we walked a property together. We did not begin with the interior. We started at the sidewalk, exactly as a prospective buyer or tenant would, and we looked at the building the way a stranger would look at it, with fresh eyes, without the accumulated familiarity that causes an owner to stop seeing what is actually there and start seeing only what he remembers. Fascia board on the northeast corner, Dennis said, on that February morning, squinting up at the roofline. Noted, I said. Downspouts pulling away from the bracket at the second floor. I see it. We went through the whole property that way, standing at the sidewalk for 5 minutes before we ever touched the front door. This was the discipline Margaret had taught me without ever formally articulating it, the discipline of seeing rather than assuming, of looking at what is actually in front of you rather than at the image of it you carry in your memory. She had applied it to buildings. She had applied it to people, too, in a way I had not always equaled, as the subsequent years would prove at significant cost. I remember that morning clearly because it was the last morning I remember being fully, uncomplicatedly myself before the heart attack changed the landscape of my body, and everything that followed changed the landscape of my life. Dennis and I walked through the entire property, noted 12 items requiring attention, prioritized them by urgency, and I drove home planning to call the repair contractors first thing the next morning. The next morning I was in intensive care. The morning after that, according to the records I would later obtain, someone began making calls on my behalf. The recovery from triple bypass surgery is not a single event but a long, grueling process that moves in small increments, each week measurably better than the last but so slowly that the improvement is invisible from inside the experience and only apparent in retrospect. You measure it in parking lot distances. This week I walked to the end of the block, last week I could only get to the mailbox. You measure it in the hour you went to sleep and the hour you woke without pain and the first morning you made breakfast standing at the stove without needing to sit down halfway through. Sandra was excellent during those months. I want to say that clearly and without qualification, because the story I am telling is a story about betrayal and it would be easy and dishonest to rewrite those months of genuine care as purely performative. She sat with me during the long dull afternoons of recovery when there is nothing to do but heal. She drove me to cardiac rehabilitation 3 mornings a week without complaint. She cooked meals that met the new dietary requirements my cardiologist outlined, researching recipes with the same focused attention she had brought to every practical challenge I had watched her tackle. Whatever she was doing to my financial life during those same months, she was also, simultaneously, genuinely present in my physical recovery. That is the specific difficulty of understanding people who do terrible things. They are rarely only the terrible thing. They are the person who held your hand in the hospital and also the person who was signing fraudulent transfer documents in another room. The two truths coexist and neither one cancels the other. I thought about this a great deal during the 3 weeks when I was maintaining the performance of normal life while the investigation proceeded around me. I thought about it the way you think about structural problems in a building you love, with clear-eyed recognition that the problem is real and the building is also real, and that both of these things are true simultaneously, and that the second truth does not change the first. My brother Robert had been a good man for a significant portion of his life. I believe that, because I watched him be one, and because the alternative, that he had always been the man who would do what he eventually did, and I had simply failed to see it, is a version of events that requires me to doubt 40 years of my own judgment in ways that seem neither accurate nor useful. He had been generous in his youth, in the specific way of people who have not yet developed the habits of scarcity that cause generosity to feel like a cost. He had lent me money once, in the early 80s when one of my properties had a roof collapse in a storm and the insurance claim took 3 months to process and I needed cash immediately to begin repairs and not lose the tenants. He had written the check without being asked twice and had not mentioned it again until I repaid it 6 months later, at which point he told me I should have taken longer and not worried about it. He had been good to Margaret in a way that was not merely performed for my benefit, in a way that I had observed across enough private moments to believe was genuine. When she was diagnosed, he had called her directly, not through me, and the conversation had lasted almost an hour, which I knew because Margaret had told me about it afterward with a kind of mild surprise that someone she had always kept at arm's length had found, in the extremity of the situation, the right things to say. What had changed him, or whether he had simply revealed a thing that had always been present beneath a surface I had not examined closely enough, was a question I turned over many times during the investigation without arriving at a fully satisfying answer. Patricia's timeline suggested that the earliest evidence of his relationship with Sandra predated Margaret's diagnosis by several years. Whatever he had become by the time he executed the fraud had been becoming for a long time before the opportunity presented itself. My father used to say, in the specific vocabulary of a carpenter from the 1940s, that a board will split along its grain when the pressure gets high enough, and that you can't see the grain until it splits. He meant it about wood, and about people, in the same breath. Robert had split along a grain that had been in him all along, invisible to me under the surface of a lifetime of brotherly familiarity, until the pressure of opportunity applied itself to exactly the right place. That is not forgiveness. It is not excusal. It is simply the most accurate explanation I have been able to construct, and accuracy has always seemed to me more useful than comfortable fictions. One of the things I chose to do with the clarity that came from the investigation, from the process of examining, in exhaustive detail, every element of what had been built around me and why and how, was to stop treating the Veterans Housing Initiative as something I would get to eventually and start treating it as something that needed to happen now. The initiative was not a complicated idea. It was a simple one that I had been approaching with unnecessary complexity, the way we sometimes circle the things we know we want to do because the doing of them feels too large and too permanent to begin casually. The idea was this, that veterans returning from service, particularly those without family support or stable housing, needed a specific kind of place to land, not a shelter, which is a crisis intervention, and not a subsidized apartment complex, which is a permanent infrastructure project requiring years of development, but something in between. A house, or several houses, managed with the same attention to maintenance and dignity that I had always tried to bring to my rental portfolio, offered at accessible rates to veterans in the transitional period between service and whatever came next for them, staffed by people who understood the specific character of that transition and didn't pathologize it. I had 3 properties in my portfolio that had been vacant longer than they should have been, held in a kind of limbo during the investigation while I waited for everything to resolve before making major decisions. When the last transfer reversal was recorded, I called David and told him I wanted to talk through a property conversion. We sat at his kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon and I walked him through the idea, and he asked the right engineering questions about accessibility and code compliance and the kind of detailed practical follow-through that had always been his specific strength. His wife Sarah sat with us for part of it and asked the right human questions about community integration and support services and how you would identify the right partners to supplement whatever the housing itself could provide. By the end of that Sunday afternoon, we had an outline. By the end of the following month, we had a plan. The James and Margaret Calloway Veterans Housing Initiative opened the first of 3 transitional homes 8 months after the last property reversal, on a morning in late autumn that felt, in the quality of its light and its air, exactly like the October mornings that had always belonged to Margaret. I cut the ribbon with a pair of scissors David had found in my workshop. The assembled group of veterans, housing counselors, city officials, and one slightly overwhelmed structural engineer watched me do it, and I said a few words about what I had learned from building things that I hoped would also apply to the specific kind of building we were attempting with the initiative, and I stopped before I got to the part about Margaret because I was not entirely certain I could finish it without embarrassing myself, and I had just been through a sufficiently long period of publicly embarrassing situations that I was conserving whatever dignity remained. Afterward, one of the first residents, a young man who had come home from Afghanistan with a leg that didn't entirely work the way it used to and a gap between the service life and the civilian life that he described as feeling like standing at the edge of something with no bridge across, found me near the coffee table and said, "My father would have liked this." He didn't say why, or which part, or what his father had been like, and I didn't ask, because some things are said to be heard rather than discussed. "I hope it helps," I said. He nodded once, the way young men from the military nod when they mean something more than the nod itself can carry. It helped. The deposition in the civil fraud case was scheduled for a Thursday in the spring, 8 months after the criminal proceedings had concluded, in the offices of the plaintiff's attorneys on the 14th floor of a building 3 blocks from the Prescott Building, a coincidence of geography I noted without attaching any particular significance to. I arrived 20 minutes early and sat in the waiting room with a cup of coffee I didn't drink, reviewing in my mind the sequence of events as I had documented them, the way I had always reviewed a project's timeline before a key inspection, not to rehearse a performance, but to confirm that I knew the territory well enough to move through it without needing a map. The deposition took 4.5 hours. Sandra's attorney, a man whose aggressive questioning style had been described to me in advance by Walter as his primary professional asset, attempted on approximately 7 separate occasions to suggest that the forged power of attorney had been a legitimate document that I had simply failed to remember signing, and on approximately 7 separate occasions I explained, in the patient, systematic manner of someone who has spent 50 years solving structural problems, exactly why that was not possible and what the evidence demonstrated instead. The attorney was a skilled practitioner of the kind of questioning designed to make a witness doubt themselves, asking the same question in different forms, introducing minor factual variations to see whether you would accommodate them, treating the space between your answer and your certainty as though it were evidence of something suspicious rather than evidence that you were a human being operating from memory rather than a transcript. I did not accommodate any of it. I had been in rooms where people were trying to destabilize me, rooms considerably more immediately dangerous than a deposition room, and I had learned a long time ago that the most effective response to destabilization is not counteraggression but steadiness, the same quality that had given me my channel's name, the quality that my father had called keeping your feet, the quality that Margaret had called simply being yourself no matter what the room is doing around you. After the deposition, I walked the 3 blocks to the Prescott building and stood outside it on the sidewalk for a few minutes, looking up at the facade the way Margaret had stood in the parking lot almost 30 years earlier, squinting at it with the assessing eye of someone trying to see what it could become. The building was in good shape, excellent shape, actually, the best it had looked in years, because the property management company I had restored after the Meridian debacle had caught up on the deferred maintenance that Sandra's people had neglected and had made several improvements I had been intending to make for years but had not gotten to before the heart attack. I thought about Margaret saying take the step, and I thought about the fold-out card table and the champagne and the morning we signed the papers on this building and how impossible it would have seemed, on that morning, to imagine standing outside it 30 years later having survived what I had survived. Then I went inside and checked on a repair the building manager had flagged the previous week, because the building needed its owner's attention and the deposition was finished and there was work to do. 6 months after the trial concluded, and 2 months after the civil case reached its settlement, a letter arrived at my house by regular mail. Not a text message, not an email, not a voicemail, a physical letter, handwritten on plain white paper, in an envelope with a return address I didn't recognize in a city 2 hours away. I opened it at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning, sitting in the same chair where I had once looked at Sandra's reflection in the bay window and heard her say the old man took the bait. The letter was from Kyle. It was 3 pages, handwritten in a small, careful hand that I recognized from birthday cards he had sent during the 3 years of the marriage, a neat and deliberate penmanship that seemed at odds with the careless person I had decided he was during the investigation. He wrote that he understood if I never responded. He wrote that he was not asking for anything, not money, not contact, not forgiveness, though he would understand the absence of all 3. He wrote that he had not known, when his mother had introduced him to me as her new husband, the full scope of what she and his biological father had planned and executed, and that he had discovered the details only after the criminal investigation became public, at which point it was already too late for the discovery to be of any use to anyone. He wrote that he had spent the past year thinking about what kind of man he wanted to be, which was a sentence that sounded like a cliché when written down but which carried, in the context of his specific situation, a weight that made me read it twice. He wrote that he had started working, a real job, in construction of all things, an apprenticeship with a trades program in the city where he was now living, which he had found through a veterans organization despite not being a veteran himself, because the organization also ran apprenticeship programs for young people who had not had the kind of foundational experiences that teach you what work actually means. He wrote at the end, I don't know who my father is. I know who he is biologically. I don't think that's the same thing. I've been thinking about what it means to build a life honestly, and I wanted you to know that the example of it I've seen most clearly is yours. I folded the letter and sat with it for a while. Then I put it in the box where I kept things that mattered enough to keep, alongside the deed to the first row house and the photograph of Margaret and me outside the Prescott building on the day we bought it and the discharge papers from my second tour. I did not write back that day. But I did not throw the letter away, and I think that tells you something about the direction, if not the pace, of whatever came next. People ask me sometimes, when I tell some version of this story, how I maintained the composure to spend 3 weeks in a house with Sandra, knowing what I knew, continuing to behave as though nothing had changed while the investigation ran its course. They ask it as though composure is a talent, something innate, the particular gift of a specific kind of personality. And I always tell them the same thing, it isn't a talent. It's a practice. and the practice began a long time before the 3 weeks in question. 40 years of building things teaches you a specific relationship with the gap between where you are and where you're going. When you are standing on the first day of a major renovation project, bare studs, no plumbing, a roof that is more conceptual than actual, you are not looking at a finished building. You are looking at a sequence of steps, each one dependent on the one before it, and the ability to hold the finished building in your mind while working on the step that is directly in front of you is not a mystical skill. It is simply what the work requires, so the work teaches it to you. The 3 weeks in that house required me to hold the finished outcome in my mind, the conference room, the documents, the legal resolution, the restoration of what had been taken, while performing, on the surface, the quotidian behaviors of a man who had no idea any of this was coming. It was difficult. I will not pretend it was easy, because if it had been easy it would not have required the particular discipline I have spent the better part of this story describing. There were mornings when I stood in the kitchen watching Sandra make coffee with the unremarkable efficiency of a person who is at home in a life that is not entirely hers, and I felt a wave of something, not rage, exactly, but something adjacent to it, something that had to be absorbed and set aside and not expressed, that cost me real effort to manage. But the work taught me to manage it. The decades of building things, and the 2 tours before the building, and the specific education of my father's hands and my mother's patience and Margaret's absolute certainty, all of it had been teaching me, for 70 years, exactly the skill I needed to survive those 3 weeks. Not composure as a personality trait. Composure as the product of practice. When Walter and I finally moved, the execution was clean because the preparation had been complete. Every piece was in place. Every document was secured. Every witness was prepared. Every contingency had been addressed. We had built the case the way I build a house, from the foundation up, honestly, with attention to every detail, trusting that the structure would hold because the materials and the methods were sound. It held. I want to tell you, before I finish, about the piece of white oak on my workbench. It is still there. I have not moved it since the evening I planed it smooth during the 3 weeks of waiting, and I do not plan to. It sits on the back corner of my workshop bench, between the plane I used on it and a small square of the first tile I ever laid, in 1975, in the bathroom of the second property I ever owned, which I keep for reasons that are not entirely rational but feel completely necessary. The oak is smooth in the way that hand-planed wood is smooth, not the dead, sealed smoothness of machine finishing, but a living smoothness, the kind that shows the grain rather than hiding it, that lets the light move across the surface and reveal the particular history of the tree it came from, the years of growth and the direction of the grain and the specific character of this piece of wood as distinct from any other piece. When I am having a difficult morning, and at 70, there are more difficult mornings than I once anticipated, not from unhappiness but from the natural weight of a life that has contained the full range of human experience and occasionally makes its presence felt at 6 in the morning when the light is gray and the house is quiet. I go to my workshop and I put my hand on that piece of oak and I feel the smoothness of it and I remember the night I planed it and what I was working through. And how it ended. And then I pick up whatever I'm currently building and I get to work, because that is what you do when you have learned, over a long time, that the work is not a distraction from the living but the living itself. Margaret taught me that, in the parking lot of a condemned row house on a cold November morning, when she asked me not whether we should take the step but simply how long it would take to get there. Keep building. Don't stop on my account. I haven't. To every man who built his life with nothing but his hands, who poured his years like concrete into something that still stands, who married right and worked right and taught his children well and found the people closest had a different tale to tell. Know this, what you've built is yours. No paper can undo what 40 years of honest work has permanently made true. A forged line on a document, a practiced copied name cannot unmake the foundation or erase the man who came. And when the courtroom closes and the last reversal's filed and you stand before the building that you built when you were wild with nothing but a discharge and a dream and $4,000 in your hand, remember what the steady fathers know: they build upon their land. They build upon their history, their loss, their stubbornness, Their love they build because the building is the thing that's worth speaking of, not the thieves who tried to take it, not the fraud, not all that pain, but the steady father standing in the autumn light again. A lone oak doesn't bend a storm by growing soft and low. It bends and holds and stays itself no matter how the cold winds blow. And what a steady father builds, through everything that's done, is the kind of life that outlasts every person who has run. I want to tell you about the night before my heart attack, because it is the last night of the life I understood myself to be living before everything changed, and because there is something important in the ordinary texture of it that makes what followed more comprehensible. I had dinner alone that night, which was not unusual. Sandra had a standing book group she attended on the second Tuesday of each month, a gathering of women she had known for years whose company she genuinely seemed to enjoy, and I had learned early in our marriage to treat those evenings as an opportunity to eat the specific things I preferred and Sandra did not, which in my case meant a bowl of chili I made from a recipe I'd been using since before David was born and a glass of bourbon I had been drinking in the same quantity since my late 30s and had not yet been persuaded to give up. I ate the chili at the kitchen table with a property magazine I subscribed to and the radio playing the specific public broadcasting station I had listened to every evening since Margaret introduced it to me in 1989. I washed the bowl and the glass and set them on the drying rack. I went to my workshop for an hour and worked on a small bookcase I was building for David's oldest daughter, cutting the dado joints for the shelves with a hand router I had owned for 26 years and still preferred to any of the modern alternatives because it felt right in my hands and I knew exactly what it would do. I went to bed at 10:30. I read for 40 minutes, the history of a bridge construction project in the early 20th century that I had been working through slowly for several weeks, pausing as I always did over the engineering details that the non-technical author had summarized too briefly. I turned off the light. I woke at 2 in the morning with the pressure in my chest that I initially attributed to the chili, which had never sat perfectly lightly despite my long relationship with the recipe. By 2:15, I was on the phone with the emergency operator. By 2:20, I was on the floor of the kitchen, which is where the paramedics found me when they arrived at 2:27. The contractor's license I had been studying for in Vietnam, by flashlight, in a tent near the Mekong Delta, had contained a module on job site first aid, and one of the things it covered was the procedure for cardiac events. I had read it without particular attention, the way you read things you are required to know but cannot yet imagine needing. I had retained, somewhere in the specific memory that keeps things your body might need, the instruction to get to the floor rather than stay upright, to keep the airways clear, to stay as calm as possible to reduce the demands on the heart. I got to the floor. I stayed as calm as possible. I kept breathing, steady and deliberate, counting the inhales the way I had learned to count things in combat, not because counting helped in any practical sense but because it gave the mind something to do that was not panicking. The paramedics told David later that my relative composure when they arrived, unusual in cardiac arrest patients, who are typically in significant distress, may have been a contributing factor in the positive outcome of the immediate intervention. I do not know whether this is medically accurate. But I know that staying steady when everything around you is going wrong had been the practice of my life for 50 years, and that on the one night it might have mattered most in a physical rather than merely strategic sense, it held. The first morning I came home from the hospital, I stood in the doorway of my workshop for a long time before I went inside. The workshop had always been my thinking space, the place where the problems that resisted ordinary thought became tractable in the presence of tools and materials and the specific quality of concentration that physical work produces. I had made most of the major decisions of my adult life either in the workshop or immediately after leaving it, because the work seemed to clear some channel in the mind that ordinary sitting and thinking left cluttered. Standing in the doorway that first morning, thinner than I had been in decades, moving with the careful deliberateness of a man who has been recently informed that his heart is not as indifferent to insult as he had always treated it, I was aware of the workshop in a way I had not been in years. The tools on their hooks. The workbench with its accumulated marks from 40 years of use. The smell of sawdust and machine oil that I had carried on my clothing for so long that I sometimes forgot it was there until I went somewhere that didn't have it. Sandra was in the kitchen making the breakfast my cardiologist had specified. I could hear the specific sounds of it, the measured pour of oatmeal, the quiet slicing of whatever fruit she had chosen. The house had been cleaned and organized in my absence, the ordinary domestic entropy I usually ignored arrested and reversed, everything in its place with the systematic attention that had been one of the first things I'd noticed about Sandra and that I had read, when I noticed it, as an expression of the same practical care I had always valued in Margaret. I understand now that what I was reading was different from what I thought I was reading. The attention Sandra brought to domestic organization was genuine, but its meaning was different from Margaret's. Margaret organized because she valued order as a form of respect for the space, for the people in it, for the time that was spent there. Sandra organized, I believe, because organized environments are easier to monitor and control, and a well-organized house leaves less room for unexpected discovery. I did not know that on the first morning home. I simply stood in the doorway of my workshop and breathed the smell of sawdust and oil and felt, for the first time since the hospital, something that resembled my normal self somewhere in the vicinity of my chest, near but not coincident with the healing incision that ran down the center of it. I went inside the workshop. I put my hand on the workbench. I looked at the unfinished bookcase for my granddaughter, the dado joints cut, the boards waiting for assembly. I didn't pick up any tools that day. I was not yet ready. But I stood there for 20 minutes, and that was enough for the first morning. David Calloway was, throughout the investigation, the person I trusted most completely, not only because he was my son and I knew him the way you know someone you have watched become themselves over 40 years, but because he had a quality of judgment that had always seemed to me to run ahead of his emotions rather than behind them. He did not react to the discoveries I brought him with the rage I might have expected from a younger man or a different temperament. He sat across from me at diner tables and kitchen tables in his own living room couch and processed each piece of information with a deliberate quietness that reminded me of the way he had always taken in news as a child, absorbing it fully before responding, never performing a reaction he hadn't actually had. He told me once, during the 3 weeks of waiting, that he had known something was wrong with the marriage before I had. Not specifically wrong, he had not suspected fraud, had not noticed any particular behavioral signals from Sandra that he could now identify in retrospect as evidence of her planning. He had simply felt, in the way of children who know their parents deeply, that the person I had married was not giving me the same thing I was giving her. You were present, he said. She was attentive. Those aren't the same thing. I thought about the distinction. He was right. Margaret had been present, in a room with me, in a conversation with me, in our shared life, in the full and complicated sense of that word. Sandra had been attentive, which is different. Attentive is observant, responsive, calibrated to you, without the reciprocal vulnerability that presence requires. I had mistaken attentiveness for presence, and the mistake had cost me 14 months of property transfers and a significant legal battle and a marriage that turned out to have been a strategic deployment rather than a human connection. David drove me to Walter's office for several of the meetings during the investigation, on the mornings when I didn't feel entirely steady behind the wheel of a truck, and he sat in the waiting room each time without being asked to, reading whatever he had brought to read, not coming in unless I asked him to, which was the exact quality of support the situation required. He was there. He was not in the way. After the criminal sentencing, when we walked out of the courthouse into a gray November afternoon, he put his arm around my shoulders for a moment, a gesture so uncharacteristic of our particular father-son dynamic that it made me understand, more than the sentencing itself had, that something was genuinely over. That we had come through something together and were now on the other side of it, and the other side looked like this: a November afternoon, a parking lot, my son's arm around my shoulders, both of us headed home. "Dinner Sunday," he said. "Dinner Sunday," I said. That was November. We have not missed a Sunday dinner since. Walter Harris, on the afternoon we concluded the final civil settlement, poured 2 glasses of bourbon from a bottle he kept in the cabinet behind his desk for occasions that warranted it, and set one in front of me without asking whether I wanted it. The cardiologist is going to have something to say about this, I told him. The cardiologist isn't here, Walter said, and sat down across from me. We drank in the comfortable silence of two men who had served together and worked together and had, in the past 18 months, navigated something that had required the particular skills the first of those experiences gave them. Outside Walter's window, the city was doing what cities do in the late afternoon of autumn, the light going golden and then gone, the office buildings beginning to show their lit windows against the early dark. I want to ask you something, Walter said. And you don't have to answer. Ask, I said. Do you wish you'd handled Robert differently? At the end of it? I considered the question the way it deserved to be considered, which was seriously and without the reflexive dismissal that difficult questions sometimes receive from people who have decided they are already certain of the answer. I wish he hadn't done it, I said finally. That's not the same question, but it's the more honest answer to what you're actually asking. Walter nodded slowly. He cooperated fully. Everything he said he'd provide, he provided. I know. I've seen guilty people cooperate for a lot of different reasons, Walter said. Some of them cooperate because it's strategically optimal. Some because they're told to by their attorney. Some because they've genuinely reached some kind of reckoning with what they've done. He paused. I don't know which category Robert falls into. I wanted you to know I've thought about it. I've thought about it too, I said. I did not tell Walter what conclusion I had reached, partly because I was not certain of it and partly because some conclusions belong to you and not to the room you were sitting in. But I will tell you, I believed, and continue to believe, that Robert cooperated for all three reasons simultaneously, and that among them the third one, the genuine reckoning, was not the smallest. I believe this not because I needed to believe it, not because forgiving him was something I felt entitled to or obligated to, but because the alternative, that there was nothing left in him to genuinely reckon, was a version of my brother that seemed, even now, to require evidence I had not been given. A man can be guilty of a terrible thing and still be more than only that terrible thing. I have known this since Vietnam, where I saw people do things that should have been impossible for them and then saw those same people do other things that should have been impossible for entirely different reasons. The human capacity for both destruction and contrition is larger than most of us allow, which is not a comfortable thing to know, but true things are frequently not comfortable. I finished the bourbon. I thanked Walter for everything. I drove home to the house that Margaret had furnished and Sandra had redecorated, and that was, now, simply mine again, in the uncomplicated and permanent way of a house that has been contested and restored and finally, simply, belongs to the person who built it. The Prescott building is 42 years old now. I bought it when it was 9 years old, when it had already accumulated the accumulated shabbiness of a building that had been built without much attention to longevity and managed without much attention to maintenance, and I had spent 33 years since then attending to it with the systematic care of a man who understood that a building, like a person, shows the character of whoever has looked after it. The lobby is the first thing anyone sees when they walk in, which is why I have always paid particular attention to the lobby. It is not an elaborate space. I am constitutionally averse to elaboration for its own sake, the kind of showy material investment that announces wealth without demonstrating care, but it is clean and well lit and maintained to a standard that I think of as the minimum of respect owed to a space where people spend time. Margaret chose the lobby's floor tile in 1993, a classic black and white pattern that she found in a salvage warehouse and immediately recognized as perfect for the building's period character. She had that eye, a consistent ability to see the solution that was already in the material rather than imposing a solution from outside the material, which is also the best description I know of how to do honest building work. You don't invent what a building wants to be. You uncover it. I have not changed the floor tile. I have replaced individual tiles as needed, sourcing matching material from the same salvage network Margaret used, because the pattern is no longer manufactured and you cannot replace it with something approximate without it becoming visible to anyone who knows what the original looked like. The care required to maintain it exactly as she chose it is more effort than simply putting in something new, but it is the right kind of effort, the kind that honors a decision that was originally good rather than updating it unnecessarily. I think about this sometimes when I walk through the building on my regular inspections, that the building contains, in its lobby floor, a decision Margaret made 30 years ago that is still correct, still present, still doing exactly what she intended it to do, which is to say, provide a dignified and honest welcome to anyone who walks in the door. That is what good building does. It makes decisions that hold. It puts things in place that remain correct across time, independent of the people who originally made them, available to whoever comes after. I do not know who will come after me. That is a question I am no longer approaching with the anxiety that drove the original succession planning Margaret and I had deferred for too long. I have updated my estate documents with Walter's guidance and the particular attention of a man who has learned, in the most expensive possible school, why those documents matter and how much care they require. David is involved in the process in ways he had not been before, not as an heir primarily but as a participant in the decisions, a person who understands the full picture because he has been part of building it. Whatever comes after, the floor tile will still be there. The dado joints in my granddaughter's bookcase will still be true. The foundation of the first row house will still be under the parking structure that replaced it, holding up a floor that nobody thinks about because it has been doing its job without complaint for 50 years. That is what the work leaves behind. Not the money, though the money matters. Not the name on the building, though the name is there. What the work leaves behind is the simple, permanent fact of a thing that was built honestly, and that holds. I want to tell you about one more thing before I finish. 3 months after the civil settlement, I drove to the east side of the city on a Saturday morning, the same time of week in the same gray, cold quality of light that I had driven there with Margaret 50 years earlier to look at the $9,000 row house for the first time. The row house itself is gone, as I have mentioned. The parking structure that replaced it is unremarkable, the kind of civic infrastructure that earns no attention and serves its purpose invisibly. I parked my truck in it, which felt appropriate in a way I didn't try to analyze too carefully, and walked to the edge of the block where the house had stood. There is nothing to see there now. A parking structure, and the edge of it, and the sidewalk, and the street beyond. Nothing that marks the fact that a man and a woman once stood on this specific piece of ground and looked at a wreck of a condemned row house and decided, between them, that they were going to make something out of it. I stood there for a few minutes in the cold. I was not thinking about Sandra, or about Robert, or about the fraud and its consequences. I was thinking about Margaret standing in the overgrown front yard in 1974 with her hands in her coat pockets, looking at the boarded windows and the sagging roofline, and saying, "How long will it take?" Not, "Should we?" Not, "Is this wise?" How long will it take? That is the question of a person who has already decided to do the thing and needs only to understand the timeline. It is the question of someone who believes in the building enough to commit to it before the full cost is known, which is the only way any building of consequence ever gets started. Because if you wait until every risk is quantified and every cost is certain, you will wait forever and nothing will get built. I had spent 50 years building things. I had lost, temporarily, 17 of the 31 properties I had built my life around, and I had gotten them back. I had lost Margaret, which was the loss that nothing could restore or compensate or make comprehensible, but which had not stopped the building, because she had specifically told me it wouldn't, and I had specifically promised, and the promise was the kind you make with your life rather than your words. I was 70 years old, standing on a sidewalk where a house used to be, in the same cold November light that had been there at the beginning. I went back to my truck. I drove to the Prescott building and let myself in with my key and walked through the lobby, checking the tile the way I always check it on these visits, looking for any that have shifted or cracked or begun to show wear at the edges. There were none. The tile was exactly as Margaret had left it, exactly as it had always been, holding. I stood in the lobby for a minute, in the building that bore her name, in the city where we had built everything we built together. Then I drove home and went to my workshop and got back to work. Patricia Okafor came back to Walter's office for a second time, 3 weeks after her first presentation, with a supplementary folder that contained things she had not been able to confirm at the first meeting but had since verified through additional source interviews and financial record requests. She sat down across from me with the same focused efficiency she had brought the first time, opened the folder, and began without preamble. I traced Sandra's financial history back to her first marriage, Patricia said. Her first husband, not Michael Voss, but a man named Gerald Hartley, whom she married and divorced before she was 30, left her a modest settlement in the divorce that she used to establish herself independently. What's interesting is the reason for the divorce. Gerald Hartley told his attorney at the time that Sandra had been found systematically withdrawing funds from their joint accounts over the preceding 18 months, in small amounts calibrated to stay below reporting thresholds, and transferring them to an account held in her maiden name. She placed a document on the table. He did not pursue fraud charges because the amounts were not large enough, relative to the cost of litigation, to justify the battle. The divorce settlement was structured to make it go away quickly. He remarried within a year and has had no contact with Sandra since. I looked at the document. This isn't her first time, I said. No, Patricia said. Based on what I found, Michael Voss, the second husband who died in 2009, had also experienced unexplained account discrepancies in the 2 years before his death. His sister, who I tracked down in another state, mentioned in an interview that Michael had confided to her that he suspected Sandra of financial mismanagement but had not been able to prove anything specifically, and that the question had become moot after his accident. She paused, choosing her next words with the care of a person who has learned to be precise about implications. I am not suggesting anything beyond financial mismanagement in relation to Michael Voss's death. The accident was investigated and determined to be accidental. I am noting that the pattern of behavior predates her relationship with your brother by a significant margin. Sandra Voss did not become a financial predator because your brother presented her with an opportunity. She came to the relationship already equipped. I sat with that for a moment. Which means Robert didn't recruit her, I said. She recruited him. Patricia nodded once. That would be my assessment, yes. Your brother had access to your estate information, knowledge of your assets, and the legal infrastructure to execute the transfers. She brought the operational experience of having done this before. The relationship was collaborative, in a way that appears to have served both their interests, but her prior history suggests she was the more experienced party. This information rearranged some of the architecture of how I had been understanding the situation, not in ways that changed the legal picture but in ways that changed the human picture. I had been imagining my brother as the primary architect of a plan in which Sandra was a necessary instrument. What Patricia was now describing was closer to the reverse, a woman who had spent her adult life developing a particular set of skills and had, in Robert, found the specific tool she needed to apply those skills at a scale she had not previously been able to access. Robert knew about Hartley? I asked. I believe so, yes. Given the depth of their relationship prior to her introduction into your life, it seems unlikely he was unaware of a prior marriage. Whether he knew the specific details of the Hartley situation, I cannot say with certainty. But he is an estate attorney. He performs due diligence on financial matters for a living. I think it is probable he knew more than he let himself consciously acknowledge, and that the knowledge existed in the territory people maintain between what they know and what they permit themselves to believe they know. That was, I thought, as precise a description of willful blindness as I had ever heard. Diane Ferris was the notary who had certified the fraudulent power of attorney in my hospital room on the 5th day of my recovery. She was 51 years old, a widow, with 2 adult children and a contract notary practice she had been building for 12 years, of which Robert Calloway's law firm had been her largest and most consistent client for 11 of those years. I never met Diane Ferris in person. I had no wish to. But Walter briefed me on her cooperation with the investigation, and what she told the county attorney's office was relevant to understanding the full mechanics of what had been done in my hospital room. She had been called by Robert on the 4th day of my hospital stay, according to her phone records, and asked to come to Memorial Hospital the following morning for what he described as a routine estate document execution with a client who was hospitalized and needed assistance with a time-sensitive signing. Routine document execution with hospitalized clients was, she told investigators, something she had done before. It was not unusual. There were situations, pre-surgery, end-of-life, unexpected incapacity, in which individuals legitimately needed documents witnessed and notarized in a hospital setting. She had done it multiple times in her career. She had no reason, she said, to question the request. What she told investigators about what she witnessed in my hospital room on that 5th morning was the piece of testimony that most clarified, for me, exactly what had happened and how. She had arrived at 8 in the morning, before Sandra was there, before any visitors were expected. Robert had met her in the hospital lobby and walked her to my room. I had been sleeping when they entered. Robert had woken me, she described him shaking my shoulder gently and saying my name, and my eyes opening. She had observed me as appearing, to her non-medical assessment, groggy and disoriented, which she had attributed to normal sleeping behavior in a hospital patient rather than to the post-surgical medicated state I was actually in. Robert had explained the document to me, briefly, describing it as a routine authorization for Sandra to handle financial matters during my recovery. He had asked me whether I understood and wanted to proceed. She heard me say yes, or something she interpreted as yes, in a voice she described as weak and unclear. The document was placed in front of me. A pen was put in my hand. The signature that resulted was made by a hand that was connected to a man who was not, in any meaningful legal or ethical sense, in a position to execute a binding legal document. She signed as witness. She affixed her seal. She told investigators that she had known, on some level, that something was wrong. That the atmosphere in the room had felt wrong, that my voice had sounded more uncertain than she had ever observed in a hospitalized patient capable of legitimate execution, and that Robert's behavior had been more controlled, more careful, than the normal comfort of an attorney and client would explain. She had told herself that she was not a doctor and could not assess cognitive capacity, and that Robert was a licensed attorney who was responsible for confirming his client's capacity, and that her job was simply to witness and certify the execution. She had allowed herself to believe what was convenient rather than what was true. She knew it. She said so clearly to investigators, in terms that cost her significantly to speak aloud and that I respect, despite everything, as at least an honest accounting of what happened. She lost her notary commission. She faced a criminal referral, which was ultimately resolved with a plea to a reduced charge that required community service and payment of restitution fees. She cooperated fully with everything the investigation required of her. Whether she has been able to live well inside the knowledge of what she permitted to happen in my hospital room on a February morning, I cannot say. But she told the truth when it mattered, and that is not nothing. I want to tell you briefly about some of the 17 properties that were transferred out of my name and that came back, over 14 months of legal proceedings, one by one. There was the duplex on Archer Street that I had bought in 1981 with money I had saved from 3 years of 12-hour days and that had been, until recently, occupied by the same family in one unit for 19 years. They were still there when the reversal was recorded. The Meridian Management Company had not bothered to alter their lease, apparently because disturbing long-term tenants drew attention, and when I called to introduce myself as the returning owner, the woman who answered, a grandmother who had moved into the unit when her grandchildren were young and whose grandchildren now had children of their own, said, "We knew something was wrong. We're glad you're back." There was the small commercial strip on the south end of the city, 3 retail units that I had bought as a distressed property in 1998 and spent 2 years renovating, and that had housed, at various times over the subsequent 20 years, a bakery, a dry cleaner, a tax preparation office, a cell phone repair shop, and a woman who sold handmade quilts from a studio space she rented for 18 years until her arthritis made it impossible. The current tenants were a small restaurant and a bookkeeper's office, both of which had been in place since before my heart attack and both of which expressed genuine relief when I reintroduced myself as the actual owner. There was the house on Maple, which I have mentioned only in passing but which deserves its own moment, because it was the first single-family rental I ever owned, the third property I bought after the original row house, and because it had been in my portfolio for 42 years and represented something more personal than the others, a kind of continuity of purpose across the length of my adult working life. The tenant in the Maple house was a retired schoolteacher named Frank who had been renting from me for 11 years and who had, during Meridian's management, been subjected to a series of maintenance requests that were denied without explanation. When I called to introduce myself after the reversal, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I want to tell you something, Mr. Calloway. When I heard the ownership had changed, I was going to look for another place. I've been renting from you for 11 years and the building was always taken care of. When those other people took over, everything changed. I stayed because I couldn't find anything as well maintained at this price. But I'm glad you're back." I told Frank I would send someone to address the maintenance backlog by the end of the month. I told him the rent would remain what it had been before Meridian took over, which was below the current market rate, and that I had no intention of changing it for as long as he wanted to stay. He thanked me in a way that was brief and dignified and that told me he had not expected this outcome and was not accustomed to receiving it, which told me something I needed to know about what the properties had been like under Meridian's management and confirmed everything Patricia had found about the quality of care that had been given, or not given, to the places people lived and worked while my name was on them in name only. I added Frank's unit to the top of the maintenance schedule. By the end of the month, as promised, everything was addressed. He has remained in the house. He sends a Christmas card every year. A year after everything concluded, I finished the bookcase for my granddaughter. I had started it before the heart attack, cut the dado joints and rough-sized the boards before my body interrupted everything, and it had sat in various stages of incompletion through the hospital and the recovery and the investigation and the legal proceedings, waiting for the moment when I could return to it with the quality of attention it deserved. The moment arrived on a Saturday in late autumn, the year everything was resolved, when I went to my workshop in the early morning with nothing on the schedule and no urgent obligations and simply began to work. I assembled the carcass first, the sides and the top and the bottom, checking the joints for square 3 times because a casework piece that is out of square will never close properly and the defect will announce itself every time the door is used. The joints were good. The dado work I had done before the heart attack was, I was pleased to discover, as clean as anything I had done in my better years. I fitted the shelves, adjusted the height to what my granddaughter had specified, she was 12 now, specific about things, which I recognized as a trait she had from her grandmother, and planed the door to fit the opening, which required the kind of patient, iterative adjustment that you cannot rush and that I had once, in the urgency of the investigation, not had the stillness to do. I had the stillness now. I finished the piece in 3 Saturdays. I rubbed it out with the oil finish I had been using on furniture for 30 years, applied in thin coats and buffed between each one, and when it was done I stood back and looked at it the way I look at finished work, with the specific, quiet satisfaction of having made a thing that is exactly what it was meant to be, neither more nor less, built with honesty and care from good materials by hands that knew what they were doing. I delivered it on a Sunday afternoon and set it up in my granddaughter's room while she watched with the focused attention of a 12-year-old who knows exactly where she wants everything to go. We adjusted the shelf heights twice. We stood back and looked at it. She said, "Grandpa James, it's perfect," with the specific authority of a 12-year-old for whom perfect is a word reserved for things that genuinely deserve it. I drove home with the satisfaction of someone who has completed something he started, which is one of the most durable satisfactions available in a human life, and who has done it honestly, which is the only way the satisfaction holds. 3 months after his probation terms took effect, Robert sent me a letter through Walter's office. It was 2 pages, typed, formal in a way that suggested he had written it many times before arriving at the version he sent. He did not ask for anything. He did not offer explanations that functioned as excuses. He said that he had spent the first months of the legal proceedings telling himself a story about his own motivations that he was no longer able to sustain, and that the story he now believed was simpler and less comfortable. He had wanted money that was not his, and he had been willing to harm me to get it, and he had used Sandra and the circumstances of my grief and my illness as the instruments of that harm. He said that understanding this did not help him understand how he had become the person who could do it, which he found more troubling than the act itself. He had spent 66 years believing himself to be a certain kind of man, and the events of the previous 3 years had revealed that belief to have been, at minimum, incomplete. He asked nothing of me. He said he understood if I never responded and that the letter was not a request but an accounting, a document, in the vocabulary of his profession, of the full state of what existed between us. I read it twice. Then I filed it in the box with the other things that mattered enough to keep. I did not respond. Not because I had nothing to say, but because the things I had to say were not yet fully formed, and I have learned, over 70 years, that the things worth saying are worth waiting until they are ready. If I respond to Robert eventually, it will be when I have something true to offer him rather than something merely appropriate, and I am not yet certain what that is. What I am certain of is that the letter was honest. Whatever Robert Calloway has become, or is in the process of becoming, the letter was honest, and honesty from a person who has recently spent years engaged in its opposite is not a small thing, even when it arrives too late to change what was already done. I know that. I hold on to it. And I continue, in the meantime, to build. I want to tell you what my mornings look like now, a year after everything concluded, because the ordinary texture of a life restored is worth describing as much as the extraordinary texture of its disruption. I wake at 5:30, which is the hour I have woken for most of my adult life, a habit installed by the military and never fully dislodged by the subsequent decades. The house is quiet. In the winter months, which in this city last longer than you hope and shorter than you fear, the darkness outside the bedroom windows is complete and the room holds the specific warmth of a well-insulated house that has been heated through the night, which is one of the small satisfactions of having spent 40 years maintaining the properties you live in to the standard they deserve. I dress without the radio, which I used to play in the morning but have found, in this past year, that I prefer the silence of the early morning to any accompaniment. The silence is not empty. A house of this age and character produces its own sounds, the settling and shifting of wood and plaster that you learn, over decades of inhabitation, to read the way you learn to read a familiar landscape. I make coffee in the kitchen that Margaret chose, using the machine I have owned for 12 years and that I have repaired twice rather than replaced because it works and I know exactly how it works, and there is something to be said, in a life that has recently been disrupted in significant ways, for the reliability of things that you understand completely. I drink the coffee at the kitchen table, looking out the bay window at the yard, which in winter is bare and brown and in spring begins its annual return in the slow, unglamorous way that all real things return, not all at once, not in a dramatic announcement, but gradually, incrementally, one green thing at a time until the gradual accumulation of small returns produces something that looks, suddenly, like restoration. After coffee, I go to my workshop. This is the invariant part of the morning, the part that has not changed in decades and that I do not expect to change, the anchor of the day that allows everything else to be flexible. I spend an hour in the workshop before anything else happens, working on whatever I am currently building or maintaining or restoring, in the specific quality of concentrated silence that early morning workshop time produces. This is where the bookcase for my granddaughter was finished. This is where the piece of white oak sits on the back corner of the bench. This is where, on the mornings when the weight of the past 2 years makes itself felt in some physical way, a tightness in the chest that is not cardiac but is its echo, I put my hands on the tools and the materials and let the work do what work does, which is to return you to yourself, your actual self, the one that exists prior to and beneath the events that have tried to reshape it. After the workshop, the day opens. There are properties to manage and calls to make in the Veterans Housing Initiative to attend to, and Sunday dinners with David and his family that anchor the week in ways I had not anticipated when we began them, but that have become, over the course of a year, as necessary as the morning workshop. I am, by any reasonable accounting, a man who has come through something that should have ended worse. 17 properties restored. $4 million recovered. The people who built the fraud now living inside its consequences. My brother carrying whatever he is carrying from his choice to cooperate with the truth rather than contest it. My son and I closer than we had been in years, forged into something more deliberate by the process of standing together in the middle of something difficult and coming out the other side intact. I am 70 years old and I am building things. The heart is monitored quarterly and has not given me significant trouble since the surgery, for which I am grateful without being naive about what gratitude in this context actually means, which is not a guarantee but simply an acknowledgement that things are currently better than they were and that better is worth noting. The morning routine holds. The workshop is there. The coffee is made at the same hour in the same kitchen that Margaret chose, and the light comes through the bay window at the same angle it has always come, and the yard does its annual returning, and the properties are maintained to the standard they deserve. I am still building. I intend to continue. There is one more thing about Margaret that I have been working up to saying and have been circling around, perhaps because it is the most personal thing in this story, and I am, by nature and training, a man who keeps the most personal things in the interior longer than is strictly necessary. She knew I would be all right. Not in the sense of a prediction, not as a specific statement she made about the future. She could not have known, when she died in October of 2017, that I would marry someone who would try to take everything we had built, and have my heart nearly stop, and spend 14 months having my life transferred to a shell company registered in my brother's name. She could not have known any of the specifics. But she knew me. She knew the specific kind of person I was, the one who had learned, in the jungles of Vietnam, to stay calm when things went wrong, and who had spent 4 decades building things rather than waiting for them to be built, and who had the particular quality of stubbornness that her family, in their generous vocabulary, called steadiness, and that the military had called, in its less generous vocabulary, an asset in the field. She knew I would be all right because she had watched me be all right through everything that had happened before, the things that had seemed unsurvivable and that I had survived, not because I was exceptional but because the tools were there and the practice was there and the habit of building rather than accepting ruin had been installed in me so deeply by the time I was 40 that it functioned more like a physical reflex than a conscious choice. Keep building. Don't stop on my account. That is the most important thing she ever said to me. And she said it with almost no breath left to say it with, and I have been honoring it every morning since with the same fidelity I would honor any commitment made to a person I loved, which is to say, completely, and without reservation, and not because it is easy but because it is what was asked of me by someone whose asking I take seriously. I take it seriously. I am taking it seriously right now, telling you this story, which is itself a kind of building, a structure made of words rather than wood or concrete, but built with the same attention to truth and the same respect for what is actually there rather than what would be more comfortable to describe. If there is something in this story that is useful to you, if you have recognized in it something about your own life or your own family or your own particular version of a trust that was violated and a thing that was taken and a question of whether it was possible to take it back, then the telling was worth the telling. And if not, the morning workshop is still there, and the white oak on the bench is still smooth under my hand, and the yard is, as I write this, in the early stages of its annual return, one green thing at a time. That is enough. That is, in fact, everything. I climbed to the roof of the Prescott building one more time, on the last morning of the year, because I had a habit now of going up there on mornings that deserved marking, and the last morning of the year in which all of this had finally concluded seemed to qualify. The city was cold and clear, the winter light coming in at the low angle that belongs specifically to December in this latitude, making everything look simultaneously sharp and slightly unreal, the way things look when the light is honest enough to show exactly what is there without the softening influence of warmth. I could see, from up here, most of the city that I had spent my adult life building inside. Not literally, no single rooftop offers a view of 40 years of work, but imaginatively, the way a person can see the full scope of a thing they know intimately by looking at one piece of it from the right height. I could see the general geography of the neighborhoods where my properties were, the rough topography of the city that I knew, and the specific detail of someone who has driven its streets in every season and every decade since 1974. 49 years, I had been working in the city. I had come back from Vietnam with $4,000 in a truck and a contractor's license I had studied for by flashlight, and I had spent the subsequent half-century building things inside it, building quietly, building honestly, building in the specific manner of a man who believes that the quality of what you make is inseparable from the quality of the person making it. The city did not know my name in any official sense. I was not a prominent figure in any of the ways that cities confer prominence. No buildings bore my name except the one I was standing on, and even that bore Margaret's name rather than mine, which was exactly as it should be. I had not sought recognition. Recognition had never been the point. The point had been the building. The point had been the fold-out card table and the lamplight and the careful keeping of accounts by a woman who believed, without any particular evidence at the time, that the accounts would eventually be worth keeping. The point had been the row house and the dado joints and the white oak on the bench and the lobby tile that was still there, exactly as she had chosen it, doing its job. The point had been this, that a man who has learned to build things honestly is not as easily unmade as the people who tried to unmake me had assumed. That the foundation, if the foundation is real, holds. The foundation held. I stayed on the roof for a while longer, until the cold made continued standing unreasonable, and then I went back down through the building that bore Margaret's name, nodded to the building manager who was doing his morning walkthrough, and went out to the street and got in my truck. I had properties to check on. I had a morning to fill with honest work. I had a workshop waiting and a new project I had been planning and a granddaughter whose 12th birthday was coming up and who had mentioned, with the specific precision of a 12-year-old who knows what she wants, that a desk would be a useful thing to have in addition to the bookcase. I put the truck in gear and pulled out into the December morning, and the city went about its ordinary life around me, indifferent and ceaseless and thoroughly unimpressed by the private drama that had played out inside it over the past 2 years, which is exactly how cities are and exactly how they should be, and I drove home to my workshop and got to work.